You don't belong here." The words cracked through the courtroom like a whip as Officer Marcus Braxton's hand connected with the woman's face. The sharp sound of flesh meeting flesh echoed off the marble walls. Blood trickled from her split lip as she stumbled backward, but her eyes never left his. Those words would destroy his career, his reputation, and everything he thought he knew about power. Because in that moment, Officer Braxton had just assaulted the one person who could end him. He just didn't know it yet. Have you ever witnessed someone so confident in their authority that they couldn't see the trap closing around them? That's exactly what happened on a humid Tuesday morning in the downtown courthouse of Atlanta, Georgia. A routine hearing was about to become a masterclass in karma, justice, and the dangerous assumption that appearance equals power. The woman stood in the defendant's box, her simple gray dress wrinkled from a night spent in holding. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and to everyone in that courtroom, she was just another face in the system. Her public defender sat beside her, a young man fresh out of law school who'd barely glanced at her file. The charges were minor, a traffic violation that had escalated during a stop. But the way Officer Braxton stared at her suggested this was personal. Officer Braxton wasn't just any cop. He was a decorated sergeant with 15 years on the force, a man who wore his badge like a crown. His uniform was pristine, his shoes polished to mirror shine. He stood at the prosecution table with his arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. To him, this was just another day, another defendant who'd learn her place. What nobody knew, what nobody could have guessed, was that Sarah Mitchell wasn't supposed to be in that defendant's box at all. The night before, she'd been driving through the city when Officer Braxton had pulled her over. No broken taillight, no speeding. Just driving while black in the wrong neighborhood. When she'd questioned the stop, when she'd calmly asked for his badge number, he'd dragged her from the car. Resisting arrest, he'd written in his report. Assaulting an officer. All lies, but who would believe her word against his? The bailiff called the court to order, but the judge's bench remained empty. A clerk announced that Judge Williams had called in sick, and a substitute would be presiding. People shifted in their seats. Delays were common. Nobody paid much attention. Meanwhile, in the hallway outside, Officer Braxton's partner leaned against the wall, shaking his head. Officer Danny Torres had been riding with Braxton for 3 years, and he'd seen this pattern before. The aggressive stops, the escalated confrontations, always with the same type of victim, women of color, people who looked like they couldn't fight back. Danny had filed complaints twice, but they'd been buried. Braxton had friends in high places, or so everyone thought. At that moment, Sarah remained perfectly still in the defendant's box. Her hands rested calmly in her lap despite the handcuffs biting into her wrists. Her lip had stopped bleeding, but the bruise was already forming, a dark shadow against her brown skin. The other defendants in the courtroom watched her with sympathy. They knew that look, the exhaustion of fighting a system designed to grind you down. Officer Braxton approached the defendant's box, ostensibly to review some paperwork with the prosecutor. But as he passed Sarah, he leaned in close. His voice was low, meant only for her ears, but in the quiet courtroom, several people heard him clearly. "You should have just taken the ticket," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "Now you're going to learn what happens when people like you don't show respect to people like me." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Her eyes, however, never left his face. There was something in her gaze, a calm certainty that would have warned a wiser man. But Braxton was drunk on his own authority, blinded by 15 years of unchecked power. The prosecutor, a tired woman named Linda Chen, shuffled through her files with barely concealed frustration. She'd read the arrest report. She'd seen the body cam footage, or rather, she'd seen that the body cam had mysteriously malfunctioned during the crucial moments. This case stank of excessive force, but Braxton was untouchable. Or so she'd been told by her supervisor. "Your Honor," Linda began, then stopped. The judge's bench was still empty. She glanced at the clerk, who shrugged helplessly. The substitute judge was running late. Braxton took this as his cue. He stepped forward. addressing the courtroom as if he were the one in charge. His voice boomed with authority. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a classic case of someone who thinks the law doesn't apply to them. Miss Mitchell here refused a lawful order, became verbally abusive, and when I attempted to place her under arrest, she struck me. He touched his chest as if nursing a wound, though there wasn't a mark on him. Sarah's public defender started to object, but Braxton steamrolled over him. I've been a police officer for 15 years. I've served this community with honor and dedication. I don't enjoy bringing people before this court, but when someone shows such blatant disrespect for law and order, what choice do I have? He turned to face Sarah directly, his eyes gleaming with contempt. This was his stage, his moment to remind everyone in that room who held the power. He took a step closer to the defendant's box. People like you think you can just mouth off to cops, refuse to comply, make our jobs harder. Well, this is where that attitude gets you. In cuffs. In court. With a record that'll follow you for the rest of your life. The other defendants shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded, recognizing the speech they'd heard variations of before. Others looked away, unwilling to make eye contact with Braxton's righteousness. Sarah finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. Officer Braxton, you're making a mistake. He laughed, a sharp bark that held no humor. A mistake? The only mistake here is yours, sweetheart. The mistake of thinking you matter. Of thinking your word means anything against mine. I'm trying to warn you, Sarah continued, her tone still calm, almost gentle. You should stop talking. This infuriated him further. How dare she? How dare this woman in handcuffs, facing charges, presume to warn him? Braxton's face flushed red. He slammed his hand on the defendant's box railing, making everyone in the courtroom jump. Warn me? You're warning me? Let me tell you something. I could arrest you again right now for contempt. I could add more charges. I could make your life so much harder than it already is. Do you understand that? Do you understand how powerless you are right now? The prosecutor tried to intervene. Officer Braxton, perhaps we should wait for the judge. No. He cut her off with a sharp gesture. I'm tired of people like her thinking they can disrespect the badge. I'm tired of criminals. And yes, that's what you are, thinking they have rights that supersede law and order. He was spiraling now, his 15 years of unchecked authority pouring out in a toxic stream. This wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. This was about every time he'd been questioned, every complaint that had been filed and ignored, every moment someone had dared to suggest he wasn't the hero of his own story. You want to know what your problem is? Braxton continued, his finger jabbing toward Sarah's face. You think that just because you can speak clearly, just because you carry yourself with a little dignity, that you're somehow different, but you're not. You're just like every other thug I've pulled over, every other criminal I've arrested. The only difference is you hide it better. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, and if anyone had been watching carefully, they would have seen something that looked almost like pity cross her face. But Braxton was too far gone to notice. He was performing now, playing to an invisible audience that validated every prejudice, every abuse of power. Officer Torres, still in the hallway, heard his partner's voice rising and closed his eyes in resignation. He'd seen Braxton like this before, seen him work himself into a righteous fury that justified anything. Torres knew he should go in, should try to calm him down. But what was the point? Nobody ever held Braxton accountable. Inside the courtroom, Braxton's rant reached new heights. And another thing, the way you looked at me during that stop, like you were better than me, like I was the one in the wrong. I'm a decorated officer. I've saved lives. I've put criminals behind bars. What have you done? What gives you the right to question me? The young public defender finally found his voice. Your Honor, I object to... He stopped, remembering the bench was still empty. This is highly irregular. Officer Braxton, you're not the prosecutor. You're a witness. You can't. I can do whatever I want, Braxton snapped. Do you know why? Because I'm the one who keeps the streets safe. I'm the one who deals with people like her every single day. I'm the one who knows what really happens out there, not you lawyers in your fancy suits, not judges in their robes. Me, I know the truth. And then, as if to punctuate his authority, as if to remind everyone exactly who held the power in that room, Officer Marcus Braxton did something unforgivable. He stepped up to the defendant's box, looked Sarah Mitchell directly in the eyes, and slapped her across the face. The sound seemed to freeze time itself. The crack of his palm against her cheek echoed through the suddenly silent courtroom. Sarah's head snapped to the side, and for a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The handcuffs bit deeper into her wrists as she caught herself against the railing. But she didn't cry out. She simply straightened, turned her head slowly back to face him, and wiped the fresh blood from her reopened lip with her shoulder. "You don't belong here," Braxton said, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You don't belong in this courtroom, in this city, anywhere near decent people, and I'm going to make sure you remember that." The bailiff, an older black man named James who'd worked in this courthouse for 20 years, stood frozen at his post. He'd seen a lot in his time, but this was beyond the pale. His hand moved instinctively toward his radio, but who would he call? Braxton was the law. Or so it seemed. But then, something changed in the courtroom. A door at the back opened quietly, and a clerk emerged, her face pale but composed. She walked quickly to the bailiff and whispered something in his ear. His eyes widened. He looked at Sarah, then at Braxton, and his expression shifted from shock to something that might have been grim satisfaction. "All rise," the bailiff called out, his voice suddenly stronger, more official than it had been all morning. "The Honorable Judge Sarah Mitchell presiding." The words hung in the air like a bomb nobody could defuse. Braxton turned, confused, looking toward the judge's entrance. The door behind the bench opened, and Sarah Mitchell, still in her wrinkled gray dress, still with blood on her lip and handcuffs on her wrists, walked through it. The courtroom erupted in chaos. People stood, sat, stood again. The prosecutor's files scattered across her table as she jumped up in shock. The public defender's mouth fell open. Other defendants began shouting questions that nobody could answer over the general pandemonium. But Officer Marcus Braxton stood perfectly still, his face draining of all color as the impossible became reality before his eyes. The woman he'd just struck, the woman he'd mocked and belittled and abused, was walking toward the judge's bench. The bailiff, no longer frozen, moved quickly to Sarah and produced a key for her handcuffs. As the metal fell away from her wrists, Sarah rubbed them briefly, wincing at the deep red marks the cuffs had left. Then she climbed the steps to the bench, every eye in the courtroom following her ascent. When she reached the top, she turned to face them all, and her expression was no longer that of a victim. It was the face of justice itself, calm and implacable and absolute. "Let me explain what happened here," Sarah began, her voice carrying easily through the now silent courtroom. Gone was the quiet, almost submissive tone she'd used in the defendant's box. This was the voice of someone who'd spent 20 years on the bench, someone who'd presided over thousands of cases and commanded respect in every one. "Last night, I was driving home from a judicial conference in Savannah. I was tired, it was late, but I was well within the speed limit and my vehicle had no violations. Nevertheless, Officer Braxton pulled me over. When I asked why, he became aggressive. When I requested his badge number, which is my right as a citizen, he dragged me from my car." She paused, letting this sink in. Officer Braxton's face had gone from white to a sickly gray. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The trap he'd built with his own arrogance was now sealed shut around him. He claimed I assaulted him. He claimed I resisted arrest. He filed a report that was entirely fictional. But I am not without resources. I called the courthouse, explained my situation to the night clerk, and she contacted Judge Williams. We agreed that I would allow this to proceed, to see exactly how far Officer Braxton's abuse of power extended. The prosecutor had found her voice. "Your Honor, I had no knowledge of this. I reviewed the file, it showed Sarah Mitchell, but without your title, without any indication. I know, Miss Chen. The falsified report was designed that way. Officer Braxton made sure there was no mention of my profession, no indication that I was anything more than what he assumed I was. A black woman in a traffic stop. Someone he could bully with impunity. Sarah turned her full attention to Braxton now. If her gaze had been firm before, it was now like steel. Officer Braxton, you have spent the last hour proving every complaint ever filed against you. You have demonstrated the exact abuse of power that has been alleged 12 times over your career. 12 complaints, all dismissed, all buried by your friends in the department. 12. The number hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Torres, who had finally entered and now stood at the back, closed his eyes. He'd known about 2, maybe 3 complaints. 12 meant this was systemic. 12 meant Braxton had been protected at the highest levels. You assaulted me in custody. You assaulted me again in this courtroom, in front of witnesses, while I was bound and helpless. You did this because you believed, truly believed, that your badge gave you the right, that my appearance, my race, my gender made me lesser than you, made me someone you could hurt without consequence. Braxton finally found his voice, though it came out as a hoarse croak. Your Honor, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know who you were. If I had known... Stop. The single word cracked like a gavel. That's exactly the point, Officer Braxton. You didn't know who I was, and that made you think it was acceptable. You believed that as long as I wasn't someone important, someone powerful, you could do whatever you wanted. That's not law enforcement. That's tyranny. Sarah stood, her full height suddenly imposing despite her wrinkled dress and injured face. Bailiff, place Officer Marcus Braxton under arrest. Charges of assault in the first degree, assault on a judicial officer, filing a false police report, abuse of authority, and deprivation of civil rights under color of law. The bailiff, James, moved forward with an expression of deep satisfaction. He'd waited 20 years to see something like this. As he approached Braxton with handcuffs, the officer finally broke. He stumbled backward, his hands up in a warding gesture. No, this isn't right. You can't do this. I'm a police officer. I have rights. You have the right to remain silent, James said, and there was poetry in his voice as he recited the Miranda rights. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. As the handcuffs clicked around Braxton's wrists, the same handcuffs that had bound Sarah just minutes before, the courtroom watched in absolute silence. This was justice manifesting in real time, justice that usually moved slowly, if at all, now swift and undeniable. But Sarah wasn't finished. She turned to the prosecutor. Miss Chen, I want every case Officer Braxton has been involved with over the past 15 years reviewed. Every traffic stop, every arrest, every report. I want his body cam footage pulled, and I want to know why it mysteriously malfunctions so often. I want a full investigation, and I want it public. Linda Chen nodded, her face pale but determined. Yes, Your Honor. I'll start immediately. Furthermore, I'm issuing a court order for the police department to release all internal complaints filed against Officer Braxton. All 12 of them. I want to know who buried them. I want to know who protected him. And I want to know how many other officers have similar patterns. This was bigger now. This wasn't just about one bad cop. This was about the system that had enabled him, protected him, allowed him to hurt people for 15 years. Torres, still standing at the back, felt his own complicity like a weight on his chest. He'd filed 2 complaints, yes, but he'd also stayed silent on dozens of other occasions. He'd told himself there was nothing he could do, but silence was its own form of protection. Sarah turned back to Braxton, who stood between 2 bailiffs now, handcuffed and broken. The arrogance had drained from his face, replaced by a fear he'd probably inflicted on hundreds of others. She studied him for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was almost gentle, which somehow made her words cut deeper. Officer Braxton, you asked me what gives me the right to question you. Let me answer that now. I'm a citizen of the United States. That gives me the right. I'm a human being. That gives me the right. I'm a black woman who has faced men like you my entire life, men who thought my appearance made me less than, made me someone they could dismiss and abuse. That especially gives me the right. She paused, and her next words rang through the courtroom like a bell. But more than that, I'm a judge. For 20 years, I've sat on this bench and watched people like you corrupt the very concept of justice. I've watched officers who were supposed to protect and serve instead brutalize and terrify. I've watched the system protect bad cops while punishing the victims who dared to complain. Today, that stops. At least in my courtroom, today that stops. Braxton's legs seemed to give out, and the bailiffs had to hold him up. The reality of his situation was finally penetrating his shock. He wasn't going to walk away from this. His career was over. His freedom was in jeopardy. Everything he'd built on a foundation of unchecked authority and protected abuse was crumbling around him. Take him to holding, Sarah ordered. I want him processed just like any other defendant, no special treatment. No calls to friends in the department. By the book. As the bailiffs led Braxton away, he looked back at Sarah one last time. In that look was the death of his worldview, the destruction of everything he'd believed about power and who deserved it. Sarah met his gaze steadily, her bruised face a testament to his crimes, her position on the bench a symbol of justice he'd never understood. When the courtroom door closed behind him, Sarah sat back down and took a breath. The other defendants in the courtroom, still waiting for their cases to be heard, stared at her with expressions ranging from shock to hope to disbelief. She looked at them, seeing perhaps for the first time really seeing what it meant to be in their position, helpless before a system that often felt designed to crush rather than serve. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, addressing them directly, what you witnessed today is not how justice is supposed to work. Justice shouldn't require the victim to be a judge. It shouldn't take this kind of dramatic revelation for abuse of power to be punished. Every single one of you, regardless of who you are or what you're charged with, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. That's not a privilege. That's a right. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning that extended far beyond this courtroom. This morning, this single case of karma delivered. 6 months later, the effects of that morning were still rippling through the Atlanta justice system. Officer Marcus Braxton had been convicted on all charges and sentenced to 8 years in prison. The judge who delivered that sentence noted that Braxton had shown no remorse, had instead maintained that he was the victim of entrapment, of a setup designed to destroy a good cop. That lack of insight, that inability to understand the gravity of his actions, had influenced the harsh sentence. But Braxton's conviction was just the beginning. The investigation Sarah had ordered uncovered a pattern of abuse that stretched back years and included not just Braxton but 6 other officers in his precinct. Some had been fired, others faced criminal charges. The police chief had resigned under pressure. More importantly, the review of Braxton's cases had led to 17 convictions being overturned. 17 people, mostly women of color, who had been victimized by Braxton's abuse and then victimized again by a system that believed his lies over their truth. Some had served time. Others had criminal records that had destroyed their employment prospects, their housing opportunities, their lives. Sarah had personally presided over each exoneration hearing. She'd looked each person in the eye and apologized on behalf of a system that had failed them. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was justice, delayed but finally delivered. The 12 complaints that had been buried were now part of a federal investigation into corruption and cover-ups in the Atlanta Police Department. The officers and officials who had protected Braxton, who had dismissed complaint after complaint, were facing their own reckonings. Some would lose their jobs. Some would face criminal charges. All would have to answer for their role in enabling years of abuse. Officer Danny Torres had become a key witness in multiple investigations. He'd testified about the culture of silence, about the unwritten rule that you protected other cops no matter what they'd done. His testimony had been damning and detailed and had probably saved his own career. But he'd also started something new. A group of officers who called themselves the Accountability Alliance, dedicated to changing police culture from within. It was a small group, often derided by other officers, but it was growing. Sarah herself had become something of a symbol, though she was uncomfortable with the attention. The story of the judge who'd allowed herself to be arrested and abused to expose corruption had spread far beyond Atlanta. She'd been interviewed by national media, asked to speak at judicial conferences, held up as an example of courage and justice. But she deflected the praise, always redirecting attention to the systemic issues, to the people who'd suffered without her resources or position to fight back. "I was lucky," she told one interviewer. "Lucky that I had the position and the power to ensure justice was done. But what about everyone who doesn't have that? What about all the people who are abused by officers like Braxton and have no recourse, no voice, no power? They're the ones we should be talking about. They're the ones we should be protecting." The courtroom, where it had all happened, had become something of a pilgrimage site. People would sit in the gallery, imagining that morning, drawing hope from the idea that sometimes, just sometimes, justice could be swift and certain. The court had to post a notice asking visitors to limit their time so that actual court business could proceed. But perhaps the most significant change was the hardest to measure. Young black women, teenagers, even children, started showing up to court hearings, watching proceedings with new eyes. They saw Judge Mitchell on the bench, saw her treat every defendant with dignity regardless of their charges or appearance, and they saw possibility. Some would later say that morning changed their lives, made them believe they could be lawyers, judges, advocates for change. Sarah kept a photo on her desk, taken by a court photographer on the morning of the incident. It showed her in that wrinkled gray dress, handcuffs still on her wrists, blood still on her lip, but standing tall at the judge's bench. She kept it not as a trophy but as a reminder. A reminder that justice was fragile, that it required constant vigilance, and that those in power had an obligation to protect those without it. On the one-year anniversary of the incident, Sarah was invited to speak at a rally for police reform. She stood before a crowd of thousands and told her story again, though by now most people knew it. But she ended with words that captured everything that morning had meant, everything that still needed to change. "What happened to me was unjust. What happened to me was wrong. But what happened to me was also an opportunity, a chance to shine light on darkness, a chance to demand better. We got justice that day, but justice for one is not justice for all. Real justice means systemic change. It means accountability at every level. It means believing victims even when they're not judges. It means protecting the powerless, not the powerful." She paused, looking out at the faces in the crowd, seeing hope and anger and determination reflected back at her. "Officer Braxton thought he could hurt me because of who he assumed I was. He was wrong about my identity, but he was also wrong about what gives someone value, what makes someone deserving of respect and dignity. Every person, every single person, regardless of their job or their race or their circumstances, deserves to be treated with humanity. That's not a radical idea. That's basic decency. And until our justice system reflects that at every level, our work isn't finished." The crowd erupted in applause, but Sarah was already thinking about the cases on her docket for the following week, about the people who would stand before her bench, about the responsibility she held to ensure that every one of them received the justice they deserved, not just the justice they could fight for. Share this story if you believe that justice should not depend on who you are but on what is right. Hit that like button if you think every victim of police abuse deserves to be heard and believed. Subscribe for more stories of courage, of people who stood up to systems designed to silence them and won. Your story could be next. Your moment of standing up, of demanding better, of refusing to accept injustice, could be the one that changes everything. Because here's the truth that Officer Braxton learned too late, the truth that anyone who abuses power eventually faces. Justice may seem slow. It may seem blind. It may seem to favor the powerful, but truth has a way of surfacing. Courage, has a way of inspiring change. And karma, real karma, doesn't care about badges or positions or assumptions about who deserves respect. Karma cares about actions. And Officer Braxton's actions finally, inevitably, caught up with him. Truth always finds a way, justice always comes. And the arc of the moral universe, as long as it is, always bends toward accountability. Remember that, fight for that, believe in that. Because in the end, it's not about one judge in one courtroom on one morning. It's about all of us, every day, choosing justice over convenience, truth over comfort, courage over silence. That's how we change the world. One act of courage at a time. One demand for justice at a time. One refusal to accept abuse at a time. Until the Officer Braxtons of the world understand that their power is not absolute, their actions have consequences, and their victims are not powerless after all.